In 2048, the Earth is overpopulated and almost all natural resources are depleted. To solve this problem, the government launches a program to genetically modify 14 soldiers who will go to Saturn's satellite Titan to establish a new civilization there. These volunteers and their relatives are relocated to a specially built neighborhood with luxurious high-tech houses. Among them is former pilot Rick, who takes his wife Abigail, who works as a doctor, and their son Lucas. The head of the program, Dr. Call, has high hopes for Rick because of his remarkable history of survival. Once a pilot, Rick was shot down and spent 3 days trudging through the Syrian desert wounded without water or food, proving his endurance. Rick and Abigail agree to participate in the program for the sake of their son's future, though Abigail admits to Call that she's a little worried about Rick's health. Call confirms that there could be complications, but reassures her that with proper care, everything will be fine. When all the volunteers have completed the move, they gather for their first meeting with Call to begin the procedures. The doctor explains how the planet was destroyed and that the next step is Titan, the only place in the solar system with an atmosphere and a primitive ecosystem. However, on Titan it rains liquid methane, the atmosphere is rich in nitrogen, and it is impossible to breathe there. Instead of terraforming, scientists have decided to genetically modify humans to adapt to Titan's conditions. One of the volunteers doubts that the organism will accept the modification, and although Call assures that the clinical trials were successful, he also admits that there is no complete guarantee of survival. The volunteer continues to ask questions, but Rick interrupts him, telling him to leave if he's not sure. The volunteers all come from all over the world and were chosen for their ability to survive in extreme situations. After the meeting, they are given key cards to access the base and escorted to the lab for the first injection of 300 to be given over the next few weeks. Dr. Freya explains the purpose of each injection, but Rick only grasps a fraction of what is said. From that point on, Rick's family adjusts to a new routine. Lucas goes to school, Abigail takes care of the house, and when she is allowed, she is by Rick's side during procedures. The volunteers quickly bond and begin to socialize off base, allowing for dinner parties. At times the conversations at these gatherings turn somber when one of the volunteers confesses that he is afraid because after 2 years on Titan, they won't be allowed to return. One day, after a particularly raucous dinner, Abigail feels dizzy from drinking, and Rick helps her upstairs. But he suddenly starts coughing and feels choking. Abigail checks on him, notices a high fever, and immediately puts him to bed to nurse him through the night. After a while, Dr. Call is satisfied with the success with the volunteers' DNA samples and decides to conduct a major test. The group is asked to spend some time underwater without an oxygen tank, and after 30 minutes, only Rick and Tully remain. They compete and Tully manages to last 39 minutes, but Rick stays underwater even longer, feeling comfortable enough to swim like a dolphin, surprising everyone. In the evening, Rick shows off his new skills to his son in the pool. Later, when he is in the pool with Abigail, she notices dark veins on his body, but as soon as Rick realizes it, they disappear and she decides not to pay attention to it. A few days later, the volunteers undergo their first surgery. One of the wives, Rayanne, visits Abigail for the kids to play together and shares her fears. She confesses that she's afraid for her husband and doesn't think he's right for this mission. Abigail comforts her, reminding her that volunteers will save humanity and that more important than their children. Rick returns home from surgery, and although he appears healthy, Abigail is concerned about the possible side effects mentioned in the paperwork. Late at night, she finds Rick in the kitchen applying ice to his skin due to a high fever. She fills more cold water for him, and they begin a game of dipping their hands into the bucket. Abigail pulls her hands out after a few minutes, unable to stand the cold, and Rick continues to hold them as he can no longer feel the cold. The next morning, they go for a run and stop at a beautiful property overlooking the neighborhood. Rick expresses regret that he can't help the planet. The experiments continue, with volunteers running with masks simulating Titan's atmosphere and spending long periods of time in icy water. Although some volunteers refuse to participate and leave, Hallie stays in the water despite the discomfort. Rick teaches her how to meditate underwater to cope with the cold. During one of the treatments, Rick notices that his hair has started to fall out, and Hallie confirms that hers has too. Shortly afterward, one of the women in the group experiences seizures and vomits blood. Medics are unable to save her in time, and the volunteers face the first death in the group. At the meeting, some begin to fear for their lives, but others are reminded that they knew the risks. Despite the ban, they decide to have a drink to ease the stress. Meanwhile, Andrew, Tally's husband, tells Abigail about the beginning of their relationship and the hope of starting a family, although Tally isn't sure she wants the same thing. Abigail notices that all the volunteers' veins are beginning to darken, as if something strange is happening in their bodies. Suddenly, there are screams coming from the street. Zane attacks Ryan, and the others hold him down while Abigail helps Ryan. The next day, Freya shows up with new medication to prevent recurrences like Zane and the dead woman. Abigail is concerned concerned about the high doses and asks to contact Collingwood, but he's not there. Abigail notices cameras in the house, which makes her wary. She takes a blood test on Rick's blood and sees that it is turning black. Soon volunteers undergo the next surgery to improve his eyesight, which temporarily blinds Rick. One night his eyes begin to bleed in pain, and he is taken to the lab. Abigail asks Collingwood to explain what is happening, and mentions that she noticed the cameras. He claims that the cameras are there for safety, and that it will all go away soon. Later that night, Abigail hears sirens and goes outside, where she sees a mutated Zane throwing Rayan out of a window, killing her. The soldiers kill Zane himself as well. Abigail realizes that the danger is more serious than it seemed, and that her family's lives are at risk. Abigail decides to use the moment when Collingwood is busy to stealthily snatch the map key from Rick and go on a reconnaissance mission. She carefully hides in strategic locations, avoiding guards, and sneaks into Collingwood's office. There she finds documents proving that volunteers are being injected with animal DNA to reach the next level of evolution, which Collingwood calls Homo Titanians. Meanwhile, Collingwood meets with Colonel Solano and NASA officials who want to shut down the program, deeming it unproven science. Volunteers become violent, and the experiment goes beyond ethical standards, instead of having a connection to space exploration. Colonel Solano insists on ending the experiment at his base, but Collingwood argues that the final decision is up to the Secretary of Defense, and they won't leave until they receive orders. Fry also tries to convince Collingwood to stop, but he ignores her. Rick is sent home, and Collingwood comes to explain to him that his sight will return in 24 hours. They didn't take into account that his brain couldn't handle the heightened senses, causing Rick's mind to become overloaded, but the new surgery will be able to fix that. Abigail can't take it anymore and demands the truth, and Collingwood admits that he does inject volunteers with animal DNA. He admits that he can't guarantee success, but reminds them that the risks were known from the beginning. Rick needs to go through the next procedure to survive, which upsets Abigail, and she becomes distant. A day later, Rick removes the bandages and realizes that his vision has been restored. He also shaves his head to prevent baldness. Later that night, he notices that he can see in the dark, which amazes him, and he calls Collingwood, confirming that he is ready to proceed with the procedure. While the family stays at home, all the volunteers go through with the procedure, but complications arise and most die. In the end, only Rick and Tully survive. The next day, Andrew, Abigail, and Lucas come to visit Rick and Tully, only to find that they have turned into mutated beings, able to communicate only through touch and at a low frequency inaccessible to human hearing. Rick presses his hand against the glass, which causes Abigail to cry, and she finally breaks down when Collingwood gives her Rick's engagement ring. In a few days, Tully and Rick are due to leave for Titan, but for now they are allowed to stay home. Rick has trouble wearing human clothes, and when Abigail tries to help, he accidentally hurts her. Rick tries to check on her condition, but Abigail is so scared that she avoids his touch. Rick spends time at the pool, where he is more comfortable than at home. One night, after putting Lucas to bed, Abigail sees Tully in the garden with blood on her arm. Rick calmly walks over to her to communicate through the tentacles growing from their fingers. At this point, the army arrives in the neighborhood, finds Andrew dead in the shower, and begins to approach Abigail's house. The soldiers shoot Tally with tranquilizers, and it takes many shots to calm her down. However, upon regaining consciousness, Tally kills one of the soldiers with her tentacles, and the others open fire, killing her. The soldiers then try to attack Rick, but he easily defeats them due to his strength. He drowns one of the soldiers in the pool, but Abigail, hearing the commotion, intervenes, stopping him, though it is too late, and Rick runs away in horror after realizing what he has done. Colonel Solano orders a massive operation to capture Rick, despite the doctor's pleas to keep him alive. Abigail and Lucas are taken to the base for safety, but the woman escapes after realizing where Rick is hiding. Finding him, she overcomes her fear and reaches out her hand, and he embraces her with his tentacles. At that moment, army helicopters appear and capture Rick. Later, Abigail wakes up at the base next to Call, who says their actions were for the greater good. The Pentagon is about to shut down the program, and Rick must be sent to Titan, as the Earth's atmosphere is dangerous to his body. Now Abigail must convince Rick to take this final step. After these events, Abigail is taken to Rick, who is being held in a glass cage. Call demands that she give him a shot of quetiapine, a substance capable of erasing his memory, like a chemical lobotomy, and thus forcing him to go to Titan. Abigail hesitates, but under pressure from the doctor pretends to agree. As the soldier hands her the syringe, she drops the box of drugs and switches the contents, taking saline instead of quetiapine. She walks into Rick's cage and exchanges a glance with him and injects him with saline. Rick pretends to be under the influence of the drug and waits for the soldier to approach him, then neutralizes him and runs through the dark corridors of the base using his enhanced vision to disguise himself. Meanwhile, Abigail goes after her son and Freya helps them get their bearings and find an emergency exit. On the way out, they meet an injured Rick, who despite his severe injuries hugs Abigail and Lucas, showing that he is still human. But that's when the soldiers under the doctor's command show up. He orders them to open fire if they don't surrender, threatening to kill them all. However, Colonel Solano sides with Abigail, saying he will not shoot unarmed people. The soldiers back him up, and the doctor is arrested. Abigail rushes to Rick and they embrace, strengthening their bond and preserving treasured memories. Later, Abigail and Freya become part of Project Titan II, who now use more ethical methods for the sake of saving humanity. Meanwhile, Rick travels to Titan where he discovers that his new body is adapted to the conditions of the planet. He has wings and can now fly freely around his new home, starting life anew.